Okay, let's address something head on just to do it and get it out of the way for future segments. Last week and in other segments, I've made an effort to remind the audience that I'm completely fine covering instances of right wing violence based on politics and of left wing political violence, and that we shouldn't be hypocrites. We shouldn't hide left wing violence to the extent that it exists. But when I do those stories, I will remind you that it's important to remember that most politically oriented violence in the United States is right wing. It's important to remind you of that, not for some kind of whataboutism, but because if we really want to deal with the issue of political violence as an apparatus in the United States, as a problem, we have to understand where it comes from. And it mostly comes from the right. Most religious violence in the United States is from right wingers. So let's actually dig into that. And the way we know things is through studying data. And there are countless ways that you can come to this same conclusion. So let's go through some of the sources. I'm sure many of you will have problems with some of these sources, which is why I'm presenting a number of different ones. Let's start with the Anti-Defamation League. The Anti-Defamation League has studied this for a very long time. Their latest report is from 2018, which makes sense since we're in 2019 right now, and it is on domestic extremist murder. 50 of 50 people killed in 2018 were because of right-wing extremism. 78% were white supremacists, 16% were anti-government extremists, 4% were incel extremists, and 2%, meaning one guy, was an Islamist extremist. Now, we can argue over whether Islamist extremism is left or right wing. The right loves to say Islamist extremism is left wing because Muslims, I guess, often don't like Republicans. This is extraordinarily simplistic and short-sighted. Religious belief to a degree that you become radicalized is by nature a right-wing perversion of religion, but we can ignore it and we can say 49 of 50 2018 domestic extremist murders were definitely right-wing extremists. 1 out of 50, I guess we can debate the specifics of it. That's the Anti-Defamation League. Now, I know some of you dislike the ADL or you don't trust the ADL, so let's go to another set of data, the CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. They've identified that indeed the overwhelming majority of violence from extremists in the United States is coming from white supremacists, anti-government extremists, including militias and so-called sovereign citizens groups. Very, very clear on the data. Some of you will say, David, I don't like the ADL and I don't like CSIS. Well, then you've got the data from the Center for Investigative Reporting, who also looked at this from 2008 to 2016, and they found 115 right-wing terror incidents, 63 Islamist-inspired terror incidents, and 19 left-wing incidents. So if you include radical Islam as right-wing, which I do, it is almost 91% right-wing. If you consider Islamist terror its own thing, it's still about 60% right-wing. And bear in mind that this includes a way broader definition of domestic terror than any of the other studies. What if you don't like any of these three studies? Well, then you can look at the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism. They maintain profiles of individual radicalization in the United States. They look at individuals radicalized since 1948, and they have found that 40% are far right, 24% were Islamist, 17% are far left, and 18% are what are called single issue individuals who could be anywhere on the political spectrum or even sort of outside of it. So no matter how you want to catalog this, no matter what set of data you look at, when you look at radicalization in the United States, when you look at what movements are leading people to commit violence in order to try to achieve their political goals or enforce what they see as their vision of what the United States is or should be, it is at minimum a clear plurality right wing. And in some ways, when we're looking at, for example, extremist murders, we're talking about 90+% right wing. The normal responses that I hear when I talk about this, well, they're not really right wing. And this is a sort of a no true Scotsman fallacy sort of thing, which we could delve into. But listen, I mean, these militia groups are right wing. White nationalism is right wing. Sovereign citizens movement is right wing. Extreme dogmatic religious belief that leads you to violence because you're angry that other people don't follow your religion, whether that's Christianity or Judaism or Islam, that is also right wing by any common sense interpretation of what we're talking about here. So that one is a common talking point you'll hear. They're not really right wing. Hard to talk to people who are going to make that argument. What about Antifa, right? But Antifa is a common one that you hear. Look at the data, big picture. Antifa is tiny. I am not a fan of Antifa. I have denounced Antifa's methods to the extent that Antifa is a sort of coherent and discrete group with methods. I'm against all of the stuff that has been reported under the guise of Antifa. Antifa's tiny. These are the broader numbers. You can't look at anecdotes. Both sides do it is another common one that you will hear, where that's why we're looking at the data to point out that, yes, both sides do it in drastically different proportion and to drastically different degrees. So we've got to take the narrative back. We don't have to be afraid of talking about a guy who attempted to firebomb an ICE facility where no one died or was even injured. We denounce it. We criticize it. We point out that that person should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. But we don't lose the narrative, the big picture narrative that most political violence in the United States is coming from the right. Do you have other data that contradicts all four of these sets of data? Let me know. I'm on Twitter at @dpakman, and the show is on Twitter @DavidPakman Show.